Yes. Solani. What's neighbor? And you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Someone's online already.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you. Let me put the music.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think we can start. Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. You are all welcome to the second session of our panel on Indigenous Knowledge, Ecology, Culture, Politics, and Resistance in Colonial Nigeria. My name is Kabiru Babatunde Amusa, a PhD student of African History at the University of Miami. I'll be chairing this session, And this session is a continuation of our panel that we just concluded a few minutes ago. So we'll be addressing issues that has to do with, indigenous knowledge, religion, culture, socioeconomy, and politics affecting Nigerian environment and rural development. Please mute your mic please mute your mic. So the themes that we'll be addressing in this panel is not limited to conservation, traditional urban medicine, livelihood, nature, and heritage. We have scholars seated on ground there that will be addressing these themes with us, and they will be enlightening us on how colonialism and colonial policies altered Nigerian history of human and non-human subjects. So I have here on my list the first presenter, Ayodele Matthew. Ayodele Matthew is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Stanford University. His research interest is on African resistance to colonial oppression within medical, social, and cultural landscape of late 19th and early 20th century West African history. The second speaker here, we have multiple presenters, and we have Tashika. We have Tashika Pile. We have Fishan, Grimadin, and Ike Oluwapo Barua. They are all from the from Queen's University. And their brief profile is that Pele is actually interested in educational policymaking, anti-colonial research methodology, and international education. She's interested in questions around culture, social, economic, political, and epistemic justice. So Fisia, on the other hand, is actually a research coordinator and has an extensive experience in teaching and research and humanitarian work. He served as a subnational education cluster coordinator and a senior mathematics teacher at Adigat University. So Barua, on the other hand, is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Education in Canada. He holds an advanced degree from the University of Ibadan, and his research interest is on African philosophy, relational pedagogy, and virtual epistemology. So also we have Onike Omotolani. Onike Omotolani is a doctoral student in the Department of History at Boston University. He is interested in the history of conflict in rural community in Nigeria, and his research is actually focusing on environmental challenges, migration, pastoralism, borderland, veterinary medicine, colonial development, gender, race, and resistance. So the last presenter is Charity Esenu, and Charity Esenu will be joining us online. And I hope she is able to join us because she has some little challenges, and she reached out to me. But if she's able to meet up, fine. But I guess she's actually giving up on our presentation for today. So each presenter has 15 minutes for their presentation. And so Matthew, you can actually start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew. Thank you for the introduction. Today I'll be talking about, just like the title of our speech, created conflict over cultural heritage, Nigerian authorities, and the making of Nigerian museums, 1936 to 1945. And I'd like to start by next slide. I'd like to start by saying that several scholars have actually done very great work on development of museums in Nigeria, in West Africa, and generally broadly in Africa. And one aspect of this body of scholarship is the fact that oftentimes there has been this marginalization of Africa's contributions to museum development, whether in the colonial, precisely in the colonial period in most African countries. And using the case study of Nigeria, which is what my research is actually focused on right now, I'd like to point out that again, scholars have done great work. Then Africans have only appeared to be probably as assistants, curator assistant, or probably as passive agents of colonial museum development. And I would like to state by saying that historians such as Gan Dugnan in 1973, and also anthropologists for Basu in 2012. We also have the likes of, curator Amanda Elman, who has done an incredible work in 2014, who actually gave account of museum development in Nigeria and emphasized colonial curators and archaeologists, Kenneth Murray and Bernard Fagg, as pioneers of museum development in Nigeria, to Unwafo, in 2021, and to Grau, doctorates in 2022. They've all done amazing work, but once again, Africans have rather, or Nigerians have rather been depicted as passive assistants or curators. And also, most of these museum development projects have been credited to colonial officials. In the Nigerian example, we have, colonial officials such as Kenneth Murray and Fagg, as I mentioned before, as museum founders. And what I'm doing in this paper is to first, reposition Africans, but precisely Nigerians, as co-producers of museums, in Nigeria. And second is also to challenge the existing timeline for African, discussion about reparation. Discussion about reparation or return of objects of Nigerian, objects in Western museums have been dated to 1950s, 1960s, especially, a period that also coincided with, this decolonization consciousness of water. But due to based on my research, I realized that discussion about reparation have actually been in talk since the 1930s and 1940s by indigenous authorities, precisely monarchs in the Nigerian example, precisely the Oba of Benin and the Oba of Ife. So those are the things we're going to be talking about today. Next slide, please. And the question here, as I've highlighted in the slide, is what role did Nigerians play in colonial museum development? How did ordinary Nigerians and indigenous elites negotiate power with British colonial authorities over cultural heritage and museum development between 1936 to 1945? And how does transactional agency help us rethink African agency under colonial? And the aspect of this is just, the essence of posing this question is just, again, to reiterate that museums, which were actually seen as colonial projects shaped by European curators like Kenneth Murray and Bernard Fagg, are actually not entirely colonial projects themselves, but they were actually, co-produced ideas by colonial officials and indigenous Nigerian authorities. Next slide, please. So my intervention here today, before I discuss this again, is to say that, monarchs and even ordinary Nigerians contributed to, first, the location of museums in Nigeria. Second, also contributed to the discussion about reparation, the return of objects, looted Nigerian cultural objects, which are now residing in Western museums like the British Museum at Waterview. They contributed to the discussion. But how did that happen? When did this whole discussion about reparation, when did this whole discussion about colonial museum development started? And this is why I presented, this historical analysis that the economic crisis of the 1930s, and what I mean by the economic crisis is the Great Depression, which led to economic progression in most colonies, including Nigeria during this period, led to these precarious situation whereby ordinary Nigerians started, looking for means of livelihood. And we can see that scholars such as Moses Ochonu have done incredible work on seeing how this Great Depression period facilitated, the looting, the short changing of currency, this all very much, anxiety going on within colonies during this particular period. And this is why, with my work, I'm able to see that during this period, Nigerians also looted cultural objects from palaces, also looted cultural objects from, storage places and what have you, and sold it. They sold these cultural objects to colonial officials, but not colonial officials in this particular perspective, in this particular period, but precisely they sold them to academics, North American professors, European professors who are interested in the topics of social anthropology and also ethnographic museum. And to talk a little bit about that is that the 1920s, 1930s was a period that saw the rise of social anthropology as a method, and also, ethnographic museum as a big, program in most of these universities. So professors, academic scholars from, this Western part of the world started moving into Africa, interested in taking or interested in, examining and sometimes buying, cultural objects in order to showcase them in a Western museum. And during this period, of course, like I mentioned, it coincided with the period when, Nigerians were also looting, these cultural objects in order to sell them to gain, again, for economic resources, for money, in order to have money to buy resources and what have you. And the implication of this art trafficking during this period was that, first, it led to this global circulation of Nigerian cultural objects. But second is that the colonial states became very much, uncomfortable with this, art trafficking that was actually existed during this period. And what they did was to introduce colonial ordinances, which I'll talk about one of them right now, in order to control cultural objects, in the 1930s. Next slide, please. And one of the ordinances that the colonial government introduced in order to control, please, yeah. So these are some of the objects that were looted by, Nigerians and, sold to these European and American scholars. Of course, there were most of them, the Ife bronzes and the Benin bronzes were part of them. And I can give an example that, Hausa Fulani auxiliaries actually sold some, artworks, some Jukun images to Leo Frobenius, an anthropologist, in the 1930s. And also the Ife bronzes excavated, partly by Europeans, but also commissioned, by Jewish Nigerians as laborers, also acquired, some of these Ife bronzes and sold them to, scholars such as, Esco during this period. So this was a period of, art trafficking, art trade, illegal trade, and what have you, again. Please, next slide, please. And now, because of this, social tension that this art trafficking has caused, the colonial government introduced the 1939 to 1940 ordinances in order to control these art trafficking. And what the ordinance actually did was to monopolize artifact trade. So the colonial government made, frame these ordinances to say that no one can move cultural objects out except they actually get permission from the state. And also there was heavy duty, export duty placed on these, cultural objects, during this period. And then the other aspect of the ordinance was that the colonial state also stated that, most of the cultural objects owned by monarchs, in Nigeria would actually acquire the status of, British Crown property. So they will become the British Crown, properties, which means that the indigenous authorities who were previously the custodians of these cultural objects have now been dismissed. They've now been dismissed from controlling their own cultural objects, and they have no power over their own cultural objects, during this period. And another, significance of the ordinance, the ordinance is that it also transferred power to the colonial government to determine the location of museums. So by 1935 to 1939, there were already discussions about how can we build museum in Lagos, And this museum that we're going to build in Lagos will stand as a museum that will collect objects, cultural objects from all over, different parts of Nigeria, right? And again, also we understand that in the 1930s, 1940s was also a period of collection, not just of objects, but also of plants, right? So during this period, some colonial officials were also already relocating, objects to the British Museum, like I mentioned before. Now that the Nigerian authorities or the Nigerian monarchs have been denied custodianship over their cultural objects, there was a lot of social tension and resistance. Next slide, please. And the two monarchs that we're talking about today who actually posed some sort of resistance against, these colonial control cultural objects. At first, the Ooni of Ife, Adesoji Aderemi, who is on the right-hand side here, and also second, the Oba Akenzua II of Benin. Next slide. So, how they posed resistance was first, this indigenous authority, the indigenous monarchs, responded to the colonial government that cultural objects are part and parcel of, their cultural, authority, their cultural rights, and they are supposed to be the ones, they are the guardians of this cultural object. It cannot be taken away from them. And even if a museum should be erected or should be built, it should be built very close to the palace because cultural objects have spiritual significance. That was the argument that these kings made. But the colonial state denied this argument. The colonial state started or commissioned FAD and Kenneth to start, looking at spaces to build museum in Lagos, denying these, chiefs and these monarchs, the power over their cultural objects. However, by the 1939 to 1942, there was already, we already had the social change of the Second World War. And what the Second World War, indicated was there was a need to recruit, indigenous population into, the Second World War effort. And it was during this period that the Nigerian monarchs also took advantage or leverage in order to reclaim their already lost, authority. And what happened during this period was the colonial states definitely to have access to indigenous population to recruit, they need to go through the indigenous chiefs, right? So during this period, they started negotiating how to restore power back to the Nigerian monarch. So the Oba of Benin and the Ooni of Ife began negotiation process, right? And like I've mentioned, like I stated, up here is that, first through what the monarch did was to introduce a Native Authority Act in 1940 in order to make clear that this act will ensure that objects remain within the palace and under the monarch control. And also, under this Native Act, they also indicated that museums should be built close to the palace. During this period, there were lots of arguments within colonial officials, especially, resident officers, district officers, and what have you. And one major argument that colonial officials were making during this period was, if we deny these Nigerian monarchs the ability to make this proclamation, we will definitely suffer setback in recruiting people for the Second World War effort. It was this argument that then, led to this 1943 ordinance that led to the restoration of, partial control to Nigerian authorities. And what this 1943 ordinance did was that.
2 minutes more, please.
How many more minutes?
2 minutes more.
Okay, perfect. So, and what it did was to, allow, restore authority to the Nigerian monarchs, and again to approve that museums should be built within, very close to places of discovery or very close to the palace, that owns the museum, right? Next paragraph. This is a picture of the Second World War II, recruitment effort. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the major argument of this project is just to say that, in contrary to what scholars have been saying, that museum development is majorly a colonial project. Museum development was majorly pioneered or facilitated by colonial officials. No. Museum development project was actually a site of contestation and negotiation between colonial authorities and and indigenous monarchs. And the implication, as we've seen, is that Nigerian monarchs successfully influenced the museum policy. And now did that happen because by 1945, the first museum that was established, the SA Museum, was built within the space that the SAS soapstones were actually discovered. right? And second is that the subsequent museums that were established, in Nigeria were also very close to the, palace where, the cultural objects that occupied that were housed in the museum were actually discovered. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We are going to note down all our questions, and then we ask after all the presenters have actually presented their papers. So the next presenter is the multiple presenters. Are they online? Are they in the room? How many presenters do we have in the room?
Just two.
Oh, okay. Tolani, then you can go ahead and present your paper.
Okay, please give us some seconds.
No problem. At least we have time. So while we are waiting for Tolani's presentation, Matthew, you actually raised a lot of issues on your presentation when you are presenting your paper. So in your presentation, I feel like you discuss a lot of things that has to do with terminologies like, looting and as effect of Great Depression. So, Tolani, are you ready?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, Matthew, we can continue the conversation after his presentation.
Okay, so
Tolani, begin for now. Still eating.
let's start. Yeah, good day, everyone. Then we are so sorry for the technical setback happened a few minutes ago. Yeah, I'm presenting. The title of my paper says Nature and Governance, Animality in Colonial Northern Nigeria. Let's start. The next slide is showing the map of Northern Nigeria. The region of Northern Nigeria is primarily dominated by the cultural and ethno-linguistic groups of Hausa and Fulani through jihad, led by Islamic scholar Madam Fodio in 1804. The jihad of 1804 as a religiously inspired conquest of the group of formerly independent states was fought by both and cavalry soldiers. The regional movement brought an end to the formerly independent Hausa state led by Abi Ullah and led by Islamic rulers. The use of horses to conquer with soldiers on the battlefield and the owning of cattle by Fulani and Hausawa portrayed jihad intersection with animality.
through cattle. One of the jihadist policy was the construction of buffer channel to the pool or river as a food site for the cattle and pastoralists. It defeated the movement of cattle and pastoralists from the peasant farm. It caused the central conflict of the early 19th century between the peasants and the pastoralists as cattle were used to destroy farms in the river valley during the dry season. The historiography. This paper is also in visiting the earliest theories of jihad, either as religious movement or ethnic urban in 1960 by scholars. This same paper is intensifying the notion of jihad, either as religious movement. So through my intervention, I'm also saying that through animality, jihad was processed as a religious movement. The geography of jihad intersecting that of animality reveals the debate of 1960s by scholars of Islamic history in Africa on jihad as religious movement, ethnic or social movement. Through jihad, the scenes of battlefield to fight religious war in several non-Muslim areas in the north, including Kano, Katsina, Gobiru, Gura, Safara, Sokoto Caliphate as one of the branches of Islamic war. Jihad as an agent of radical Islamic expansion is a religious movement putting Islam at the center of scholarship, combining religious, social, and political functionalities. Jihad was a of Sokoto Caliphate, Futatoro, Futajelov, as an Islamic revolution connected to the global context of revolution in Europe and America. In the period of the Atlantic War, West Africa underwent their transformative social political change, as enforced by Muslim reformists. The economy derived from the slave economy, coupled with the influence of jihadist leaders, contributed to the expansion of the Muslim state as non-Muslim Indian paid tax for protection called Chiza. Jihad in Sokoto follows the Quran and Hadith, putting the spirituality of the Prophet Muhammad as a guideline in Sokoto as a peripheral area of Mecca. So my first question is, the first question is jihad a religious movement of ethnic movements? How jihad that formed the Sokoto Caliphate impact the relationship between pastoralists on one and farmer on the other hand? Issues of African animals are imagined. In the emerging literature on African animals, were no human actors such as cattle and horses portrayed as actors by jihadist leaders and Hausawa in the 19th century. In the philosophy of animality, such as cattle and horses, speak to Hausa and Fulani. How did jihadist leader resolve conflict between the farmers and cattle pastoralists to mark the success of period of liberty, which means war settlement? What led to the migration of pastoralists from four Hausa Fulani states into the non-Muslim states? How did the weapon aid jihadists and Hausa expedition in the 19th century? So the argument is that we need to engage and comprehend the scholarship of animality as non-human actor to uncover the history of jihad in northern Nigeria. Part of the reason because so many scholars have tried to expand the scholarship of jihad in so many ways. Example is how jihad intersects geography, how jihad intersects politics, how jihad intersects economy. So my intervention is that if you look at the intersection between jihad and animality, example is how horses was on the battlefield. Example is how cattle rearing, cattle pastoralism shaped the social relationship in the 19th century. In the north, the horses participated as warfare animal, warfare soldiers, and cattle as integral part of the nation, shaped the crisis between pastoralists and peasants as troublemakers, mismakers of provocateurs in the Hausa state, which later turned to the Hausa Fulani areas in the 19th century. The existing scholarship are focused on colonial and post-colonial issues of resource conflict by using the lack of vegetation caused by the climate change to highlight the need to conserve soil nutrients and promote ongoing plant development, as well as serious disappearance of grazing pastures, dryness, and the conversion of agricultural site into private estate in the north. So this paper uses animality to examine the philosophy of both Hausa and Fulani that contributed to the jihad of 1804 as a religious movement. The concept of the animality examines the nature of animals, ranging from physical and instinctive qualities. Both cattle and horses have weight, but respond to strength and thinking, enabling them to navigate with men. They both have We do have to survive in an environment of factors competing for survival. Traditionally, the Fulani own cattle, own and manage cattle across Sahel, but the Hausa also own cattle. The relationship between the cattle and pastoralists need to discuss their cattle management strategies to know how to analyze here. The relationship assigning cattle to the class of educated animal has the ability to lead to instruction by working in the ways of their instructor, distinguished from their animal in the wild areas. The training in the domestic environment, educated cattle trades and an imperial economy, and also a strong using to find the strange relationship with middle belt, the southern part of the harvest stage where conflict between pastoralists and farmers centered on the cattle destruction of farmland. So my sources, let me go back to sources. Yeah, I'm using aeroponicus, I'm using Altamini manuscript, travel document of it, everything, and that, and another German places. I'm also using Colonial report for my intervention in this paper. So, you know, scholars have talked about animality, such as Professor Tariq to look at animality in colonial Nigeria. His book actually position animal as his actors in colonial, because the use of horses aided the transport of goods, cattle trade aided the colonial economy, and even animals such as dogs also support aided the colonial security in the colonial area. So my view is that animals can also be studied in colonial areas. Why? My intervention is because of the use of horses in the battlefield and how cattle shape the relationship between the Fulani and the Hausa in the 19th century. I related to scholars talking about animality, talking about the active notion of animal, but I can't mention them here. But also that they are looking, so that literally, there are many. So I want to go to the next slide. Let me go to the cattle indigenous. The conflict between peasant and pastoralists due to the cattle destruction of farm intersected with jihad, as in latter history is complete without issue of animal, physical and institutional politics, focusing on cattle and horses. The issue of animality, including horses and cattle, is changing the focus of jihad from ethnic movement to religious movement. Due to the jihad impact, covering religious, political, and social aspects, as the movement reflects both human as citizens of Islam and non-human as properties of the Muslim faith. The ongoing study of human and animal relations, which form interdisciplinary studies, where animals are interpreted by science, social science, and humanity, put animals in the mean, attentive, and active scholarship. Why are cattle assigned to capital relations? And why does men use them to justify status in the world? Why did the caliphate focus on cattle tax and slave tax for the protection? Why is pastoralism understood as language of space, pasture, cross-border between cattle and Fulani pastoralism? The intersection of cattle created a means of partnership as a source of wealth generation in the distant trade of the 19th century. The identification of the problem is that most of the deepest animal studies are documented that best made to colonial writing, and often by outsiders, including Cleverton and Elenbar's travel documents and colonial records. Usman Afudi letter can be one which contains the promulgation of Islam, share a relationship with cattle, the protection of Muslim faithful and their property, which included cattle and other human actors owned by Muslim, Fulani, and Muslim believers, who were the converted Hausa in that state, was equally connected to the theory of defensive and offensive mechanism stated in his writing. Jihad was an Islamic revolution viewed through the lens of radicality. It really accelerated the expansion of the movement cattle trade, cattle through normal, who set of food and were involved in wealth creation. Cattle issue in the harvest state in Colonial, as Kano Colony notes that Hausa people own cattle, starting moving from 1136 to 1194, these other cattle for sacrifice during the World Injury. New Africanus, an explorer in the 16th century, know that Hausa Emirates were known for their abundant cattle population. It is thought that New Africanus can strengthen the Kano Colony on 100 cattle used by the Dimasu as sacrifice during the World Injury. New Africanus further pointed that Abe village, such as Katsina, Dora, Kano, Sera were pastoralists. and that many cattle were slaughtered in the markets. The Kano Chronicle also know that Saki Kutumbi, who reigned from 1623 to 1648, was the first Saki to collect visa from the Fulanis waiting for protection, which can strengthen the Africanus report. Saki Kutumbi collected in the form of Tingali, especially 100,000 to the Jaffa clan. During Jihad and Muhammad Awali, who reigned from 1781 to 1807, faced economic problem. He was advised to build 40 cattle for the cattle pasture to solve the farmer problem. As the sheep were scarce, as the sheep were scared of the farmer, he got angry and ordered the country to punish that with asses. If not found in that, he was out as was trapped in the yard and driven out in the family. So the relationship between the cattle pastoralists and cattle pastoralists formed a network rooted in Sharia regarding feeding and wealth creation. The pastoralists as a people or racer assigned the role of provider, and cattle as a form of property assigned the role of wealth creation and other nutritional value. According to Quran 16, chapter 16, verse 5, under Sunnah, a cattle is created from you. From them, each life work and numerous benefits, and of their meat you shall eat. As cattle grows in population, the wealth of pastoral increase. However, so I want to move to the aspect of how cattle intersected to climate change and how climate change affected the sociology between the pastoralists and the farmers. However, the climate in Sahel region in 19th century shaped the nature of the conflict in the valley. The dry season from October to December allowed the peasants to rest from hard labor, put to work during the dry season, during the rainy season. From May to September, during this time, the cattle and the pastoralists entered the farm to eat up the farm produce, destroying the farm because the logs to the cook or the farm was closed by the searching for water. This led to the minor seasonal crisis between the peasants and pastoralists. Predominantly in the 19th century. So, on the side of the tribes, aside from the constant threat of the soil oligarchy of pasture, both cattle and tribe pastoralists do deserts well as an alternative during dry season. It means that during this time, the early 19th century, despite that the cattle entered the farmland, there was still a way that they at least manage the conflicts. So the sources of jihad from 1804 to 1820, evidence is start from Fulani. They changed from that of subjugated that of political elites, taking up the administrative role, which under people have as Islamic training scholar, warrior, or administrator. In this way, the government by organization by policy, needed by where Hausa were positioned as subcolonialists, as if the imperial government will carry out daily job. They were to cover who spread the doctrine of Islam, which is when was part of Shilebawa, what I refer as a sedentary people and living among the Hausa city states. So, in 1824, a report by reporting reported that on Faso near Kano was observed during the travel. In 1817, there was a rebellion. From the Hausa towards the Fulani. So this rebellion led to the creation of Ribat, which means war city, war settlement, which you can modernly call rural basin area or ranching, because this place protected both human and animal. So in 1824, according to Cleverton, reported that Fanisa near Kano, where he observed during the travel, the establishment of the path in Magaria, Kandai, and Uno in Lima Valley, in Northeast, as well as Ribat is insulated on the link of overlooking in Lima. These factors were commonly connected to the concentration of resources found in the River Valley. Through irrigation in the River Valley in the eastern section of the Sokoto Calgary was of international term that defined the connection between the human and non-human. It provided a source of livelihood for the people of the country and animals, including cattle, horses that needed to be protected from invasion of Idim Hausawa led by Abdul Salam by leaving the river. Similarly, the settlement pattern also occurred after Gobiawa threat of Isangara, owing allegiance to Sokoto. In the settlement of Gobiawa has been in present Niger State under the Mayapi in the 1830s. The battle strategically connected to the security operation to stop any form of rebellion from the Hausawa. The Niger policy, unfortunately in 1850s, the Niger policy failed. The resources and enslaved people and the natural resources were insufficient for human and non-human after the 1850s. Based on past reports, the river of Mono appeared neglected and dirty. Some pastoralists with smaller cattle population had to stay near the world settlement because their livestock was not large enough to support their migration. As a result, they began farming and derived only small portion of their livelihood from the cattle. In the early days, cattle pastoralists can be categorized into three groups: the settled, the semi-settled, and the nomadics. The settled can still be regarded as farming pastoralists or agro-pastoralists due to the dual particular function of raising livestock and fertility crops. The nomadic pastoralists focus on the carrying cattle to distant locations with abundant resources. So I want to move to the next slide. Yeah, Usponafodio letters called Tanin al-Iwan warned the non-Muslim faithful about the affair of the world, placing Allah out of their central focus as the supreme day, as a prelude to the jihad. As this part of a unique factor in studying the preparation of the jihad, the basis of the operation was defensive and offensive. That was projected to defend the right of Muslim believer as the right to teach and win soul for God through the direction of Islam. In the same process, the offensive part was meant to destroy non-Muslim practice among the Hausawa and anywhere Islam was not being practiced, bridging the gap among military history, technology, and environmental history, which swiftly identified the type of animal suited for military expedition in the Sahel region in the 19th century. The impression of bonds among the humans, between human and military animal had linked to the protection of both Muslim and non-Muslim. In Islamic texts and historical texts, horses as military animals are frequently depicted as symbols of strength and power, particularly in jihad. They are often seen as instruments of military and are used in the imagery of both Muslim faithful, aristocratic personality, and military expedition to expand Islam. They are used for cavalry charges, carrying supply and weapons. Both horses and other human partners share means of communication, as noted that they boost the morale of the cavalry soldiers to utilize the bond they create with weapons. The issue of jihad using horses created a network of human and non-human actors by attacking their enemies and defending enemies from enemies. The acclimatization of horses, relatively in early central Sudan for breeding purposes, need to supply gap, resulting in high importation costs of social, business, and military reasons. Hausa horsemen uses horses from Hausa state and travel from beginning to fight jihadists. Most Hausa horsemen provide horses on the side of jihadist leader. Also, Fulani cavalry soldiers acquired Arabian horses from Bauchi and Manda as eastern province of Borno. The battles in the Abia state, Borno and Adamawa from 1854 were fought by troops and cavalry soldiers composed of Hausa, Kanuri, and indigenous people of Adamawa. Their troops and cavalry soldiers were manually connected through weapons such as sword, arrow, daggers. A sword is categorized into offensive and defensive. Among the offensive weapons used are those designed for close combat, such as dagger, which infantry soldiers always carry in their sheath and at the tip of their hands. The crossbow is another critical weapon in close combat. Additionally, cavalry men primarily utilize the cuffs, which were slung across their shoulder. In Hausa states, the use of horses, where both Hausa and Fulani soldiers fought each other, paved way for the victory. Horses were portrayed as legendary gifts for export and symbol of elite wealth for aesthetic display at special events. As Bello, in fact, and in his impact, shows the account of Sokoto caliphate, religious movement intersection. Horses and horsemen were mentioned to portray the importance. Muhammad Abdullah in his work has been identified the use of horse to represent theme of power, mobility, and bond. Horses possess Islamic symbol, quality of bravery, bravery and beauty. According to Napoleon, in his book, Fire with Truth, the use of horses in line with God's will, such as preaching or fighting the river, command a place on the day of judgment. The Battle of Tabane marked the first battle between the Fulani soldier and Hausa soldier in Lake Kwato Gobi in 1804. The Gobi primarily employed the extensive use of superior cavalry and foot soldiers against the smallest portion of the jihadist cavalry soldiers. The formation of jihadist actors successfully defended against the successive charges by the Gobi cavalry. The death of the commander of Gobi cavalry proved the victory of the Fulani. The sacking of Gobi Yufa fled. His right hand men, Yakati, another were killed in the battle. Abred Apodio, the head of the army forces and horses, moved to the lakeside. So in December 1804, the Battle of Tiswa between the Fulani soldiers and Gobi soldiers. The battle showed the Gobi armored cavalry soldiers meeting with the smaller portion of Fulani soldiers. It indicated that Fulani horsemen had no advantage over Hausa horsemen. When we arranged another group aligned with Gobi soldiers, Hausa who had combated Islam fought on the forts in the Fulani alliance to attack Gobi. Gobi soldiers led by Lupa routed and killed their first soldier. Hausa horsemen operated as a combat force, serving as a shock weapon, but was not uncommon for brilliant horsemen to distribute themselves through the remarkable fates. While the setback of Tiswa was difficult, Danfodio redirected his energy elsewhere and working with allies in the town, they brought about victories. Suarez, who had changed side, met jihadist force in the major battle of Almasa in 1804. It was hard fought, and at the time, the army who fought and almost entirely with Aga were missed, but generally did not seem to have fought hand to hand. The Irish won, but the high force. This was considered morale, collective bravery, and the individual determination of cavalry or foot soldier tied to jihad. The destruction of unbeliever, as mentioned in translate, is a radical way of expanding the doctrine of Islam. Thus, in the Fulani army, religion provoked an exhortation of population that drove them to clear anything for the faith of their wings.
Sir.
Both Hausa, no, sir. But I'm about to handle. Both Hausa horsemen and Fulani cavalry soldiers were composed of various aristocrats possessing genuine skill capable in modern times to the artillery that ensure Europe dominance over the rest of the world. Their horses still decorated with important and adorned with shield and amulet were ridden by proud and vigorous cavalrymen armed with saber. However, according to Muhammad Bello, the Hausa military horses were armed, while Fulani military horses were not. The armored horses were there, and beating them was an achievement. Given the importance, combat tactics often favor the cavalry. It is responsible not only for carrying orders, but also for marching troops, providing swift assistance to struggling combatants, receiving enemy, and animating the pursuit. Sometimes the reports are biased, as many army exists where the class and status divided between us and foot soldiers. The role of horses may well be exaggerated by the riders or horses. Riders or horses, tendency to by the sources author. The study of both foot and cavalry soldier function lie with their specialization as they are trapped in different terrain that may be difficult and have high strategic mobility. They are assigned with different roles, supported by power, intensive operation, and defensive effectiveness. Hausa horsemen operate as a combat force, serving as a shock weapon, but it was not common for brilliant horsemen to distribute themselves through remarkable feats. The Battle of Akarawa fought in 1804 was a pivotal event between Nigeria led by Napoleon. It marked the fall of Akarawa, Gobi state capital, and Sandy River demise. The victory severely advanced.
Tolani, please round up, please.
Yeah. Yeah. So, advance calibrate and something that need dominant community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It's a very long discussion, and I hope we have a robust conversation. Matthew, I want you to go back to your presentation. I'm sorry because I thought other presenters would, make it up to the presentation, and so I caught you like almost in the middle of your presentation. So I would want you to please tell us more about your the theories that you use in your presentations, your paper, and your research, and then give us like a brief overview of what you suppose, like what you ought to have told us initially, that the time did not permit us to give you the opportunity to do that. And then we go to the question and answer session.
Okay.
You can just do it briefly, like 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just take 3 minutes because that's
Okay.
everything that I wanted to say. But maybe like the historiographical significance is what I can talk about. I don't know if you see on my slide, but I can also just go down here. But the major historiographical intervention is just first to, of course, acknowledge that several works have been done on museum development, but also just to again, depart from what existing scholars have been saying, that it's this particular set of colonial officials that facilitated museum development and what have you. But what my work is saying is that there's need for us to revisit, this whole idea of colonial museum establishment, precisely in the case of Nigeria, and to look closely at the discussions about museum establishment as a site of negotiation between Nigerians and colonial officials, and not just a dominant, narrative of colonial officials imposing, the idea of, building a museum, where to situate the museum, what objects should be in a museum, or what have you. My intervention is just to say that, scholars really need to, again, look closely and see how the first museum that was established and subsequent ones were actually informed by the politics and the political, interplay and negotiation between the colonizer and the colonized, right? But also the second aspect of, the second historical intervention, which the first historical intervention is more about agency. The second historical intervention is also to say that, yes, scholars have talked about reparation, scholars have talked about, this call for return of object and what have you, repatriation of what have you. And they've located these discourses, this discourse within the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, the festival, how these big festivals, support discussion about reparation and what. But what my paper is also saying is that, again, we need to also look closely again, go back to the archives, read, more, or read against the grain to see that discussions about reparation, again, has been ongoing even before the 1950s. Discussions about reparation has been ongoing since when the Oni of Ife, Adesoji, Aderemi, and the Oba Kezua had made the native authority ordinance, proclamation. Since when they've actually, challenged the colonial government from converting all cultural objects in southwestern Nigeria, in southern Nigeria generally, from becoming the British crown property. Since when they started calling for the, the return of, so most of these objects have been transferred by colonial officials to the British Museum. Since when they've been having that conversation, so what my work is doing is just, making intervention within these, two different historical, discourse, right? And the last aspect, which I would have shared, but I think it then requires me to go back, is this idea of transactional agency that I'm trying to introduce. And the idea of transactional agency is, is to look at how, again, the discussion of agency. Yes, scholars have talked about how Africans have agency, how Africans have, power, how they've been able to do this. But I'm also saying, using this, as a case study, that there are certain agencies that can wield that are very temporal. And these sort of agencies are agencies that only exist when there are tensions and conflicts, especially during the Great Depression. And an example I'll give is that at first the colonial government introduced the 1940 ordinance, but then when the 1940 ordinance, which disregarded or dismissed indigenous authorities, right? But then when there was the need for recruitment and conscription into the Second World War, right? The indigenous authorities, right, saw this as an opportunity and they wielded a new type of agency. And the new type of agency they wielded was very transactional in terms of, we want to do this for you. And for us to do this for you, you have to do this other things. So the colonial government wanted to use the indigenous authority to recruit people. The indigenous authority wanted the colonial government to restore their authority. So it's a transaction of power, right? And we can see these actually as some sort of episodic or temporal or or what have you, negotiation in times of tension. And this is like going against the general assumption of this form of continuous agency that scholars have actually always attributed that in every situation you see agency, but like what form of agency, right? How do we think about this? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. It's time for question and answer. People in the room there, do you have any question for the presenters? Okay, I have questions. So while we are waiting for others to, ask their questions, let me just use the opportunity to ask you these few questions. My first question goes to Matthew. I'm so much interested in your research, and this is because, when we talk about conservation, most times we usually downplay the aspect of museums and, traditional arts, sculptures, and so on and so forth. And so first, the use of looting during as a result of, the Great Depression, as a result of the economic and the hardship that came with the Depression, and then looting as a form of resistance to colonial economic control. And so these are, let me say, complex conversation when we talk about colonial policies in colonial Nigeria. And so I want to put it to you if you see any linkage between looting and smuggling in your paper. The concept of looting and the concept of smuggling. There is a twist in the use of these terms as a result of colonial policies and as a result of economic imposition on the indigenous people. That is one. Two, there are numerous ordinances that operated in 1940s in Nigeria, especially after the Lilting Constitution. So the Lilting Constitution in Nigeria is a very complex constitution that we ever had, that, there are numerous conservation. This was the period when, the Wild Animal Preservation Ordinance was redirected. The Forest Ordinance was redirected. A lot of ordinances were redirected. So I want you to please give us the title of the ordinance you are referring to in the 1940s. If you do have it, you can please let us know. And now again, I came across this PhD thesis by Collins Bowles. I don't know if you've heard of the name before. He had his PhD last year from the Northwestern University. And so his thesis was basically on the artifacts, museums and artifacts in Ile-Ife. And so when I read part of his paper, it was making reference to the fact that colonial officials actually intentionally took away some parts of the art from the museums for reason best known to them. And maybe this has to do with depression or not, is something that I've not really, because I'm not done reading all the thesis. I just read some parts. But from the abstract, which I could tell, it was like he is making a claim. Excuse me. He is making a claim that the colonial officials has a way of manipulating or using the I'm sorry, using the indigenous people to, downplay the role of the traditional institutions. I don't know if you agree with his view or not, but I can email you his the title of the research, and also you can use it to do another grand findings. Also, there is a presentation, an article I found online. This article was published by the Journal of West African Studies, edited by Michael Crowder. And there is a session on local influence and traditional leadership, the politics of Ife Forest Reserve by Oyeleye Oyediran. So, although this scholar talks about forest reserve, but in the conversation about forest reserve is making a huge reference to how the Onis, which you use, the Oni Adesoji kind of use his role to, manipulate the industries, the timber industry in Ile-Ife, which led to revolt from the youth, several agitation on maybe the forest should be taken away from the custody of the kingship or not. And so I think based on what you based on what you said on your paper and the presentation, I feel like this has some kind of similarities on how political institutions have actually used their power, and influence to, exploit in collaboration with the colonialists to, quote and unquote, defraud the indigenous people and their resources. And so maybe this is a deliberate attempt or not. I'm leaving that to you to decide. To Omotolani, thank you so much for your presentation. I kind of have a wide interest in how you use animal to, discuss the concept of jihad, the influence on the indigenous people, etc., etc. But I am so much interested in asking you if in the history of the jihad, there are some cultural tradition of the indigenous Hausa or Fulani people that influence the use of some certain animals. That is one. If there is any cultural relationship with the use of certain animals. And the second question I'll be putting to you is, in the Hausa tradition, do they have a link to certain animals as totem in their tradition? Is there a link to certain animals among the Hausa Fulanis in their tradition? Do they have like animal totems that they use as a form of cultural or spiritual or religious affiliation? So these are my questions. And also, I think we have a few questions online. Okay, the first question here is from Ayodebami. Ayodebami is asking that how did the Fulani people felt against the Fulani threats, the Hausa threats? Oh, no, I think this time around, our questions is, I'm redirecting our question, is how did the Hausa people felt against the Fulani threats? How did the Hausa people felt against the Fulani threats? Again, she's asking another question that after the 1914 colonialism in Nigeria and the World War that ended, and the Second World War, that did colonialism change, I'm trying to reorganize this question. So she's asking that after, I don't know if this question is for Tolani or for Matthew, but the question is, after colonialism after the amalgamation of the 1914 and the Second World War, was there a change in power during this period, and why? If there is, and why? I think this is a generic historical question from her, trying to understand the concept or the impact of World War and leadership in Nigerian governance. So this is a generic question that we can actually answer after the whole of this presentation. So thank you. You can discuss that in probably like 10 minutes if we don't have any questions.
We have some questions in the room.
Oh, please, let's take all the questions. Yes, if someone is raising their hand, please, let's take all the questions.
So, like your own, this is the first time.
Please, can you come closer to the speaker so I can hear you?
Thank you very much. So for Tanani, this is the first time I'm seeing this perspective when it comes to like criminality, because my thinking was geared towards dogs, cattle, but saying horses was wild, and kudos to that. Thank you very much. My question is related to Matthew. Funny enough, when you are talking, there was a statement you made that those artifacts we are seen as spiritual symbol, and the kings wanted it to be domiciled in their their palace, and that took me back to some years ago when I went to the museum, and I was like, oh, so it all made sense, because that museum is very, very, very close, just at that entrance to the palace. I'm like, oh, fine. So that gave much more better context. And secondly, my question is bit much more technical concerning your paper, because I believe that when you make some facts, there's a need for backing. There are some sources from Polanyi's work, which I saw when he was mentioning Chronicles, manuscript, and the like. But for yours, that was absent, because you mentioned that that Nigerians sold, they looted and sold loot to some, and I'm like, okay, fine. Like, I'm not disputing it, but from which source? Like, I was thinking that, okay, probably you say, okay, this particular scholar, or probably from the National Archives, it was said that, oh, Nigerians, Fulani, they stole Jikun artworks and sold them to this other person. That corroborates and gives the work much more substance, because, to be sincere, like what Jama would say, he would say this work is not different from a journalist writing, but with references, gives it much more viable backing. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you. There's another hand. I'm seeing another hand behind you. Yes.
I would just like to follow up on that question, because I had a similar thing, because yesterday I went to Amanda Hellman's
Please
book
tell
talk.
us your name. Tell us your name and then ask your question.
My name is Elaine Sullivan. I noticed that yesterday, so Amanda Hellman wrote a book on the history of the National Museum in Nigeria, and she gave her book talk yesterday. And she said when she was a PhD student, her goal of her project was to find the African voices, almost exactly what you said. And then she said what the struggle she had was not being able to find them in the archives, and then interviewing Ekpo Ayo, but really only having that to go on. And so I guess my follow-up is, how are you going to address this same obstacle?
All right, thank you. Someone else is asking a question. Please tell us your name.
Okay, my name is Precious Edemadu. So, from what I got from you said that your argument is based on that the establishment of museums in Nigeria was done on mutual agreements, right? Based on the negotiation part of it. So, and you said that they had a kind of partial control. So my question is, why the partial control? Okay. And then secondly, what was the outright implication of that event in the post-colonial Nigeria, like based on museum and cultural heritage preservation? What's the outright implication of it? Of the partial, like you said, they had partial control, right? So my question, I'm not trying to link it to the post-colonial Nigeria. So I'm just trying to ask, what is the outright implication based on the museum/cultural heritage preservation? Okay, that's my question. And then I also wanted to say, was it actually based on that? Was it actually the negotiation that bettered that partial control, or was it based on necessity? That's what I just think.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tuloko by name. So my question goes to Matthew. I'm not sure you are done. Are you with me? All right. So in your discussion, you spoke about there being a partial agreement between the colonial master and the monarchs. I would like to know what are the partial agreement they had. So I know that one of them was that when we were establishing museums in Nigeria, the major aim for the museums to be established was for the interest of the whites to be entertained. And as time goes on, that's why we see that most of these museums established are mostly established in the GRA centers that is not close to the people, but to where the whites are. So I guess for them, that would be their own agreement. And I guess as time goes on, this has been a trend in the Nigerian museum that you don't see a museum being established most time among the communals, but in GRA where it's settled. So what are the partial agreements between the colonial master and the monarch? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Habibat Ibrahim. So I have a question for the two presenters. No, okay, I have a question for one, then comment for the other second one. So Tolani, my question for you is, the Fulanis are usually known as a cattle pastoralist, kind of people. So, and I mean, you already showed us that they use a lot of horses during the jihad and everything. So, how do you find out how they got those large horses since they were not settlers kind of people? So that's my question. Then for Matthew, I'm already familiar with this your paper because we've discussed it, but I would just like to add that the artifact, because I'm an archaeologist actually, so the artifacts are the traditional rulers had a kind of museum, before colonialism. So they were already preserving those artworks, and those artworks are cultural meaning. So the traditional rulers, they know the significance of it, that's the cultural significance. So naturally, they will also want to be part of the establishment of the museum, even if they had like less power, in terms of who gets to say what. But because they've been preserving this object before colonial people came, they had to get involved in the preservation, the continuous preservation. So I think that should also be something that you should emphasize on, that they've been preserving this before they came, so they have to get involved with it. And this whole commercialization of artwork also started, from my own knowledge, started from the Benin should I even say what was should I when the Benin loot, let me just in it. So it was when they started packing those artwork that they started having commercial value that led to this looting and smuggling that we have now. So I just want to add that. That's all. Thank you.
All right. Please, we are actually running out of time. We have less than 15 minutes to finish our paper. So you can give a brief comments for 5 or 6 minutes each. Yeah. Any of you can go first.
I'll start with Amsa. Thank you so much. This is excellent. Amsa, you asked 4 questions. I'll start from number 1, where you talked about the interconnectedness between looting and smuggling. And I want to say that based on my sources, for example, the Hausa and the Fulani auxiliaries, they were actually looting the Jukun images and artworks in the 1930s. What they did was they looted this artwork. The Western professionals, the Western academics, the arts traders were waiting at the Cameroon borders, in order to take these artworks, to the border and then exchange them for money. And these traders, these illegal traders, waited for them at the border, they exchanged this, and then they moved into Cameroon. From Cameroon, some people dispersed to Mali, and from there, most of these artworks actually ended up, in French museums, British museums. I have names of the museums, so I'll save us the time. So yes, looting was definitely prominent, and we can also look at the example of during the Nigerian Civil War as well. Most art historians have done a lot of works on how, during the Nigerian Civil War, from Cross River, people moved. They used that social tension, the war, to loot, artworks, and actually sold most of these artworks, to museums. If you go to the UCLA museum, if you also think about the prominent again, European collectors. I'm blanking out on the names, but most of the collectors actually, they collected, most of this illegally traded museum. I can, recommend anyone to read the work of, Benedict Savoy, a French art historian who has actually done a lot of, illegal trafficking, to really look at how, most of these looting were also, most of these artworks were transferred from, places of tension and conflict, to and ended up in Western museums or European museums, North American museums. And then regarding the ordinance, the name of the ordinance that you referred to, the first ordinance that I actually mentioned was the Antiquity, Ordinance of 1940. And then the second one that the Native Authority actually introduced was the 1943 Native Authority Act, which you can actually cross-check at the Ibadan archives. And then, Paul, you asked a question about reparation, and then, you noted the thesis that you read and how, most museums actually do, hide objects and what have you. I had an experience at the York Museum in California where they actually have Benin bronzes, but they decided not to display these Benin bronzes because once they display these Benin bronzes, it will attract attention and it will attract the call for reparation, of course. And I went with my class, we saw these Benin bronzes, just, they are all, I forgot the names they call the basement where they store, artworks. So most of these Benin bronzes were actually stored there. So it's a conscious effort, again, to evade discussion about reparation, but also sometimes maybe it's also some of them might be, again, might be in bad shape, they might actually be trying to repair them and what have you. So there are different reasons why, certain arts might actually not, the labor will be there, but the object itself might not be there. It's actually just be an empty case. And then, thank you again for, referring me to that article of Oyeleye, and in thinking about the role of traditional rulers. Of course, Ranger, Terence Ranger, of course, the Isaac Ban, of course, Frederick Cooper, all these scholars have done a lot of work about, traditional chiefs, and of course, Asiwaju as well, and, Adi Ajayi, they've done brilliant works on traditional chiefs. But what we're seeing right now is also the fact that while these chiefs were, positioned to resist, right, they are also collaborators in a lot of ways, right, collaborating with the colonial government for their own selfish interest and what have you. So yes, that's an aspect that, my narrative, or the minority only focus on the resistance, but probably it's very interesting to see how probably some Obas collaborated with colonial officials and what have you. And then, to move to, discussions about salt, which I don't know, Mr. Lekmo, thank you so much for, pointing that out about the house auxiliaries I mentioned. And where I got that from is from Richard Fadon's book, Introduction, The Middle Benue. It's a chapter, and the whole book is Central Nigeria Unmasked, Arts of the Benue River Valley, edited by Mala Burns. And Mala Burns, I think, is a curator at the UCLA museum. So it's on page 223 precisely, so if you're interested to check that out. And also, when we're thinking about the other sources that are used, if you go to ProQuest, you can just search look for all these collectors of the 1930s. Look for Frobenius, look for Escobies, look for all these guys. They have, newspaper articles about them, and they discuss some of the collections. They discuss how indigenous people acted as collaborators. Indigenous people collected, they looted items, gave it to these, professors. These professors took it to, especially, think about Escobies Wisconsin, I don't know. I can't remember the school guy was still in Southern Australia. But they have all these artifacts. They were studying them in class, right? And most of these artifacts ended up in the museum. So yeah, and then thank you for your question about looking at voices and whatever. Yes, the archives can definitely create some sort of liminality or silence about indigenous voices. But like I said, it's just most important for us as scholars to read against the grain. And and how I was able to uncover these voices is again just reading through this ordinance and within these discussions, right? I was able to see references to these kings. One thing I did not see, of course, is a whole page where the king is saying, "Oh, blah, no." How I was able to read through, and I saw some of these making reference to King Aderemi Adesoji made this statement, right? So of course it's from the perspective of the colonial officials, but then that does not dismiss that it represents a part of the discussion that was ongoing during this period. And my work in my paper, I have all the sources there. Oh, very much, when it's published, I'm very sure it will serve as a point of importance. And Amanda is a wonderful scholar. I read your book and I'm really fascinated. But I just think there's an extra mile that we all have to go with this research. Then also thinking about the question about partial control. So the reason why I mentioned partial control, because of course, if they are giving the others full control, right? Most of the museums that we have today will not just be established very close to the palace, but they will be established just within the palace themselves, right? And also, if they are giving them full control, then most of the objects that are still outside of, Nigeria, what have you, the colonial government would have made significant efforts to bring them back. So in terms of control, I'm saying that, yes, they ceded control to them. They approved the right to establish a museum very close to the palace. And that was the extent they would go, right? Even by 1950s, 60s, 70s, when the likes of Ekwoyo, which, was referenced here, when they were trying to bring back the Queen Ida mask, the British Museum gave them a duplicate at first. They did not want to release the original. I don't even know. I can't remember if they ended up getting the original in the field. So they ended up using the duplicate. So those are the kind of conversations that kind of like engaging with. Like, yes, there's partial success, not full success, but also it's also very questionable. What is full success? What is partial control? What is full control? And yes, thank you so much for raising the point about significance of indigenous museums, how are these kings also preserving their cultural objects? I think that's an aspect I should explore. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Colonial, you can answer your questions in brief, 5 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you for the comment and the question so far. Yeah, the first question in history of the art, cultural tradition, the influence of animals. Yeah, when we look at the Fulani, either the Tokawa or Sulebawa, when we look at them, the one thing is common to them, which is the use of animal, cattle especially. And then when we not just suppose it with the Tokawa Fulani, who tends to go out to preach the gospel of Islam. What we see there is the use of animals, the use of horses for movement. So, and then they are part of them. When we look at the work of at the examinations of Abdullahi, even the Bello, we look at it that most of their the purpose of their jihad is connected to the Arabite, is connected to Islamic world. The use of horses has been used in the Islamic world. The use of cattle has been used in the Islamic world. So connected to the same thing. Then when we look at that same jihad of Sokoto, it's also connected to the same process that led to the jihad in Futatoro and Futajalo. So the use of animal is especially significant to the Fulani. Then next question, the use of animal for cultural purpose. In Kano Chronicles, the Sakin Didimasu in 21st century used 100 cattle for sacrifice for building projects. So they use cattle for building projects. So if that is culturally significant to them. Also, the Fulani also see cattle as their partner, as a source of wealth. They see cattle as a source of wealth. They see cattle as something that bring them profit. Just the same way the horses also created bond between the jihadists and the partnership between jihadists and other. So both animals are significantly connected to them. And then you ask a question, what's me? Abibat has a question about the how do they get their horses. Yeah, aside the fact that the Hausawa who converted to Islam donated horses for the jihad. The jihadists also got horses from northern Africa. They also got horses from Borno, the southern Borno, the Bauchi, to aid the jihad. Especially the expedition of Lamido in the southern part of Borno, in Adamawa area, they got the horses just to aid their invasion towards unbelievers. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you everyone for attending this session, and thank you so much the presenters for this robust presentation, well researched, well discussed, and well communicated. We appreciate you all for coming. Please endeavor to join the last session of this panel, and that will be coming up next, I think in room B103. Yeah, you can join us in room B103. Thank you all.